Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Today's session is Climate Change and the Law. Our featured faculty today will be Harvard Law School professor Jody Freeman. Jody, the virtual floor is yours.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for logging in. It's a pleasure to be virtually with you. I'm very happy to take a lot of questions today, so I actually will try to keep my remarks pretty short. I thought I would just set the scene for you now that we're a year into the Biden administration on how climate change is going for the Biden team as an issue, as a policy challenge, and talk a little bit about the major initiatives that his team has started, reflect a little on what's happened in Congress on climate change, and then touch on the courts and the role the courts are playing. And I think if you have that kind of 360 view of the major players, the Biden administration, Congress, and the courts, you'll have a good sense of where we are in 2022 on climate change. And then I'll let you guys ask whatever might be on your minds and do my best to answer. So to start off, as with many issues across the board, from immigration to tech policy to virtually everything you can think of, the Biden team's first task when taking over was to restore regulations that they thought the Trump administration had rolled back unwisely. And the world of climate change and energy policy is no different. The Biden team came in and effectively reversed a lot of deregulating that they saw the Trump administration had pursued. So just some examples, if you recall, essentially President Trump had either frozen or rescinded or rolled back every major Obama administration climate effort, whether it was regulating carbon emissions from the power sector, whether it was trying to control emissions from the oil and gas industry, whether it was withdrawing from the international climate agreement known as the Paris Accord. Across the board, the Trump administration sought to reverse those forward-leaning climate policies. And so the Biden administration came in and stopped all that, asked the courts for some time while they held the regulations that the Trump folks had adopted and put them in abeyance, meaning just put a pause button, really hit the pause button on everything, and then began to move forward. And so what they've done in the first year is, and this is primarily the Environmental Protection Agency, which has the legal authority to take these steps under the Clean Air Act of 1970, which we can talk about. If you want to talk a bit about legal authority, I'm happy to do that. But for now, all you need to know is there is an overarching law about air pollution under which the Environmental Protection Agency also regulates greenhouse gases. And what they have done in the first year is move forward on setting a new round of standards for cars and trucks to control CO2 emissions from the transportation sector. And those car rules were finalized just at the end of December. And they are the most ambitious greenhouse gas emission standards for motor vehicles from 2023 to 2026. So for the next few years ever set. And then we're expecting the Biden team to come with a new round of standards for the out years for cars and trucks that will roll out from 2027 and beyond. And all of those standards are really designed to ramp up over time and drive electrification. They're intended to drive the adoption of electric vehicles. As you know, President Biden pledged that half of the new cars sold in 2030 will be zero-emission vehicles. And the auto industry, including GM and Ford and others, have lined up to say they have an aspiration or a goal to make sure that at least half of all new cars and trucks, up to 40%, sometimes 50% of them have pledged, they've pledged new cars sold in 2030 or 2035 will be electric or zero emission. So that's a big promise. And the federal government has moved to create a set of rules underneath that that will force improvement year over year for the auto industry. The other big rulemaking that the Environmental Protection Agency issued, this one is a proposal, it's not yet final, but it gives you a sense of where they're headed, is to set methane leak standards, essentially, methane standards for oil and gas facilities. It's a comprehensive new approach to control methane which is a very powerful, very potent greenhouse gas. Methane has effects in the present time, in the near term. So you can make a lot of progress by controlling it because it's really the single fastest, most effective opportunity we have to reduce the impact of climate change. So this methane rule is very important, and it's comprehensive because it covers all of oil and gas operations, production, processing, transmission, and the rest. So it's a far-reaching regulation, and it also controls methane leaks, not just from new facilities that come online, but from older existing oil and gas facilities. So it's a very important rule. The more you detect the methane, the more you monitor the methane, the more you can control the methane from these operations. So that's the second important sector that the Biden team has identified as a big contributor to greenhouse gases. And the third sector is the electric power industry, power plants, coal and natural gas fired power plants. And there's a big battle over how to regulate the electric power industry that has really shifted into the courts. I'll say a couple words about that, but just to identify this as the third leg of the stool, if you will, of the major climate rules coming from the administration. They are right now working on, and I would expect within 6 months or so, to see a proposal for a new carbon standard, set of standards for the electric power industry. The old Trump approach was litigated. It wound up in the courts. The DC Circuit Court of Appeals struck down the Trump rule regulating the power sector. It was a very weak rule. It also adopted a very narrow cabined theory of the government's authority. It said the government couldn't do much to regulate the power sector. That was all struck down by the DC Circuit, and it's headed to the Supreme Court. And that's a strange situation because the rule doesn't exist anymore. Trump is not in power anymore. There's actually no rule regulating the power sector, and yet the Supreme Court did grant review and said it would hear the case. So there's some concern that the court wanted to do that so that it could use the case as an opportunity to send a message to the Environmental Protection Agency not to get out over its skis with the next regulation. That's a complicated legal situation that they find themselves in. But the message is they've been busy. They've been reversing course from what they viewed as a Trump undermining of climate rules and putting stronger rules back in place. So why do they have to do this? Why is the president using his executive power with executive branch agencies like EPA to put in place a climate plan? That's because the United States Congress has largely failed to adopt an approach to climate change. And so although there was some hope that Congress would pass a major policy, perhaps even in the reconciliation bill, the budget bill that you saw successfully went through, the budget bill included a lot of money for COVID recovery and infrastructure, as you know, but there was hope that it might include a grant system for clean energy also, that it would include grants for clean electricity. If the power sector improved year over year, they would get some grant money. If they failed to improve and move in the direction of wind, solar, other renewable power, if they failed, they would be penalized, kind of a budget grant and tax system for clean energy. That failed, never made it through the Congress. And so there's really been no signature climate program that's come from the Congress. Some money for electric vehicles and infrastructure, that's been very positive, but nothing major, nothing regulatory, nothing that would drive greenhouse gas emissions down. And what that means is if the Congress isn't adopting climate policy, the president's got the executive branch, the laws on the books that he's trying to use to make as much progress as possible. The third thing and last thing really I'll mention is that the administration, of course, the president went to the Glasgow climate meeting. This is the annual conference of the parties. They get together, the parties to the Paris Agreement, and they discuss the strengthening of their pledges to reduce their own greenhouse gas emissions. And under President Biden, the team went to Glasgow and upped the US commitment to the Paris Agreement by saying, we're going to be more ambitious, more aggressive. And President Biden announced an ambition to reach 50 to 52% reduction in U.S. net economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, which is a very significant pledge. And delivering on that depends now on these major regulations I've talked about to control methane from oil and gas, to control CO2 from the transportation sector, and to eventually put limits on CO2 from the electricity sector driving clean power from electricity. The president also pledged that we would have carbon-free electricity in this country by 2030. So this is a lot of ambitious pledging on climate. It's taken the shape of the pledge to the Paris Agreement in order to bring other countries along to say we're back at the table, rejoining the Paris Agreement after the Trump administration had withdrawn the United States, to get back on track. It's all to the positive, at least in my view, but the rubber still needs to meet the road. These rules have to be final. They have to be final before the end of the first term. They need to be built upon in a second term or by a new president if they're committed to climate change. And it will be a long ground war. It's especially hard with Congress not prepared to take significant action. The very final thing I will mention, I think I said final before, so that was the near final. This is the very final thing, is that much of the controversy over climate change is going to now take place in the courts. The Supreme Court's complexion has changed. As you know, there are now 6 justices appointed by Republicans who appear to be poised to undo precedents. They're not being shy about willingness to reject government regulation when they think that the government has overreached. This happened with the vaccine mandate, as you know, that came from the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. That was a shot across the bow. That decision from the Supreme Court saying this is too broad a read of your power under the Occupational Safety and Health law, even though that is a very broadly worded statute that gives OSHA a quite capacious power to set workplace safety standards and to protect people from new hazards. Nevertheless, Supreme Court shot that down. I think that's a signal that the court will not be shy about its skepticism toward broad government regulation. And I think in the world of climate change, we're waiting to see what the Supreme Court may do to clip the wings of the Environmental Protection Agency. There's some concern that the court's reading of the Clean Air Act will be cabining the authority of the agency. So if that were to happen, we'd be left in a world, in the United States anyway, where the Congress is largely inert, largely inactive on climate change. The executive branch, the president of the moment, is interested in being ambitious with the agencies and the powers that the president controls, but the president is constrained in the story I'm telling, potentially severely constrained by a Supreme Court skeptical of regulatory power. And I suppose the starkest way to put it is we could find ourselves in a place where climate policy is not being made by the United States Congress, nor is it being made by the elected president carrying out delegated power under laws long on the books, but it's being made by 6 Supreme Court justices who are unaccountable and unelected. And if we were in that situation, I think that would be an uncomfortable place for climate policy. And it wouldn't be bad just for this country. I think our leadership on climate is crucial for bringing and keeping into the coalition the rest of the major economies and the largest developing economies of the world. And our leadership is crucial. So my hope is that the Biden administration succeeds. My hope is that the court does not severely constrain the EPA's authority, we'll see, and that success will breed success as we move forward into the rest of the administration. I will say the industry, the auto industry has largely signed up and lined up in favor of the new car standards. Quite a considerable section of the oil and gas industry has been supportive of comprehensive methane regulation. And there's a significant swath of the electric power industry, the utilities, that want EPA to regulate their sector. They don't want the court to scuttle the EPA's authority to regulate them. So I think that's significant. Industry buy-in is significant. And I think a good story that the Biden administration needs to continue to develop. So that's all I would say by way of overview at the moment. And I'm happy to take questions.
Jody, thanks very much. And you said that the rubber meets we're looking for where the rubber meets the road. How long is the road? That is to say, is all of this futile because if the administration turns over at the end of the first Biden term, then everything's getting reversed? Or are there safeguards that have been put in place, could be put in place in order to keep forward momentum?
It's a great question. It is a feature of the American political system that when a new president replaces an outgoing president, they essentially have the controls, they have the con, which means they can use the agencies they have and interpret statutes using the flexibility in those statutes and the laws to pursue their policy preferences. Law is often leaves some ambiguity for interpretation, and presidents can use that ambiguity. So the short answer is, yes, some of these things can be rolled back. Rules can be undone and redone by new presidents. They're not legislation. They're regulations, and they can be adopted and rescinded. But very well crafted rules that take advantage of developing technology often have some durability because industry starts to adopt changes in response to the rule and makes investments based on those rules and actually comes to be dependent on the program, or at least has expended some time and effort on the program and might in fact want to defend it or parts of it against change. Because what industry tends to want is predictability and reliability. So it's not always the case that a rule can be entirely unwound by a new president. And I think EPA is trying very hard to build regulations with support from industry that can be more effective in cutting GHGs, but also durable over time. There's no guarantee, but I think they really have their eye on that long-term sustainability, which means building rules that have some industry support and buy-in and reflect the kinds of technologies that industry wants to use to comply. Instead of being so abstract, quick example, if you design a methane rule that incentivizes the oil and gas industry to adopt the latest technologies, if the oil and gas industry discovers a cheaper technology that can monitor methane leaks, like a sensor, a cheap sensor that can tell you when you've got a leak, and the rule allows the company to adopt the latest thing, the cheapest thing, that's a good rule. And that's a rule the industry would want to support instead of locking in a less effective, more expensive technology. So that's just one example.
The naive among us, including myself, where do rules stop and laws start? So what are the things that the president can do, and where you understand that the courts may come in and constrain that? And what are the things that are legislation?
So this is very law school. I apologize for those who didn't want a basic law tutorial, but here's a very basic thing we teach in law school, which is legislation is either federal or state. It's what happened when the elected officials adopt a bill, make a bill into law. So in this case, Congress would vote on the bill, it becomes legislation, the president signs it, that's a law. To change that, of course, you need to amend it. So again, you go back through bicameralism, two houses vote, the two chambers vote, the president has to sign it. If the president vetoes it, you need a 2/3 override. That's legislation. It's very hard to undo and do simply because it's hard to get Congress to act, right, as we have learned. The regulations, when we talk about rules or regulations, that's what agencies adopt. So the EPA or other agencies you know of, think of the Securities and Exchange Commission, think of the whole suite of federal bureaucracies. They can adopt regulations which bind industry. Industry has to comply. The financial industry has to comply with rules that the Securities and Exchange Commission issues. So they have the effect of law. They're binding. And if somebody violates a rule from an agency, they might have to pay a penalty. But those are subject to change by issuing just a new rule from that agency, so that when a new president comes in, they can rescind the last president's regulations and the agency can put out a new regulation. It still takes a couple of years usually to issue a new rule. It's not that fast, but it's not like legislation. The commonality is they're binding on anybody subject to them. So that's why we talk about rules as if they're law-like, they're legislation-like, because they do create this binding feature, this binding impact.
So they're both binding, but one is more flexible to be both enacted and overruled.
We talk about legislation as enacted by the Congress, and we talk about rules as issued or promulgated by an agency. We never talk about a rule as enacted, because enacted is the thing that Congress does. They enact legislation. Anyway, I feel like I just taught Schoolhouse Rock, but that's basically it.
Well, I'm just a bill. I'm just trying to understand.
Exactly right.
Let's talk a little bit about the Supreme Court, since you focused our attention on that. Let's do this in a couple of ways. First, you mentioned that the Biden administration is in the peculiar position of having to defend a Trump era regulation that is no longer even valid. But why does the Biden administration, why is it have to, or why is it choosing to defend it? I mean, as our questioner points out, the Obama administration declined to defend the Defense of Marriage Act. So it's not, is it automatically true?
No, I mean, there's a strategic question around what posture the administration wants to take. Remember, it's still the government, right? This is the same EPA, just under a different president. So the rule that was struck down, the Trump rule that was struck down, belonged to the EPA, if you will. And now that rule goes up to the Supreme Court, and the government has to figure out what position it's taking on that rule. And so this government is not going to defend the Trump era view of narrow, constrained authority under the Clean Air Act. They will not do that. They will defend the prior administration's legal interpretation, the Obama era view, which was we have much more flexibility under the Clean Air Act. And just to be less abstract, let me just put it this way. The Obama team read the Clean Air Act to say, look, the statute says we set the best system for reducing emissions in the power sector. The best system is something that reflects what the whole electricity system can do, thought of as a giant connected machine. And it can do a lot of things. It can bring in more wind and solar. We can ramp up and down coal power. We can ramp up wind power. The thing operates like a giant interconnected machine. And the best system gives us flexibility. A standard that is the best system gives us flexibility to pull all the levers on the giant machine. That theory of what the law lets you do, the Trump administration totally rejected. And they said, no, best system means things you can do at the plant, to slightly improve the efficiency of the coal plant, which means not very many reductions of greenhouse gases. So the legal interpretation makes a massive difference to how much flexibility you have to set standards to reduce CO2. And what this team is going to do, the Department of Justice now, is going to have to defend really the Obama rule, the most ambitious version, even though they may not adopt that. In other words, the Biden administration might not embrace the most ambitious view of its power, because that they think might set up the court to invalidate it. So they're in a delicate posture. What they're choosing to do in this particular lawsuit, and the argument will be February 28th if you want to tune into supremecourt.gov and hear the oral argument. The posture I think the Biden administration will take, this is the Department of Justice, right? They represent the administration. The Solicitor General will be arguing, the Office of the Solicitor General. And the posture I think they're going to take is to say, you shouldn't hear this case at all. You took it, Supreme Court, but really there's no rule in place. Nobody's being forced to do anything. There's no utilities in the country that are complying with anything. There's no cost to anybody because there's no rule in place. And so nobody has standing, nobody has legal standing to sue. That's what the briefs say. And they're really putting a lot of emphasis on that off-ramp, hoping, I think, that the court will realize we took the case, but it's really not ripe. There's no rule in place. Let's give the government a chance to put a rule back in place. And the backup argument is that actually there is lots of flexibility in this law. The Obama view may not be our view, but it's a legitimate view. And be careful if you cabin our power too much, because you might cut off avenues that the industry wants us to take. So watch out. And the electric power industry has filed a brief saying, we agree, don't completely demolish the EPA's authority to regulate us. So the industry that stands to be regulated is actually in the litigation saying, careful, Supreme Court, don't go too far. And the industry that wants to unravel EPA's power is not the electric power industry, it's the coal industry. The coal and the mining industry, they're the petitioners in this case. So that's a lot of complexity, but I'm sure you guys got the basics. There's an off-ramp for the Supreme Court here, which is to say nobody has any standing because nobody's being harmed right now.
All right, this is very helpful. So we've talked about legislation, we've talked about rules, we've talked about potential cabining by the Supreme Court. We've talked about industry wanting some level of authority placed upon them by rulemaking agencies, so there's a level playing field. Some other mechanisms. Lawsuits, is something like Juliana versus the United States going to go anywhere? Is there a channel there?
So you are all familiar with these lawsuits in which cities and sometimes states and non-governmental organizations are suing parts of industry for contributing to climate change through their greenhouse gas emissions. And they're looking for either damages or they're looking for money to put into adaptation. And these suits have not been terribly successful so far. And there's a long history to them. We've seen litigation over this since the early 2000s, suing the power sector, suing the oil and gas sector, saying that you're the reason that we've got all these greenhouse gas emissions historically, and so you must pay the liability for causing related harms. And part of the struggle of these lawsuits is that proving causation, attaching certain emissions to certain harms is very challenging when you have a global problem like climate change, where there are so many millions of emitters around the world and going back in time historically, that it's hard to say these emissions are responsible for this harm. And that's a legal problem. I mean, that's a problem the law creates by creating a rule of having to prove causation when you're suing for harms caused. And as a result of that and some other legal issues, the suits have not been successful and the courts have turned them back. So I'm not that optimistic about those lawsuits. I really understand why petitioners have brought them. I really get the impetus for them. I think they are partly a political strategy to keep a spotlight on the largest industrial emitters. I understand all that. I just think from a legal perspective, I'm not that optimistic about their success. And if anything, the court's composition, the Trump administration appointed an awful lot of federal judges. At least in federal court, I think the probabilities have gotten even worse simply because of the complexion of the judiciary over time. So you may still see some of these lawsuits and they garner a lot of attention and they can have some political benefits, but I think as a legal matter, they have a tough time succeeding.
There's a related question about enforcement. How effectively are these rules and laws being enforced? I mean, whether that be current appointees or past appointees, are the rules? Let me put it this way: are the rules and laws ones that once passed and either promulgated or enacted can be trusted, or are we now at the second level of how closely are the enforcers doing their jobs?
Well, it's a great point that there's one thing to issue rules from agencies and it's another thing to enforce them. Again, I'll bring up the Securities and Exchange Commission just as a non-climate example. You can, tell companies or individuals not to engage in insider trading and, not to defraud investors. But unless you enforce against the people who do, it's meaningless, right? So same here, you issue pollution rules and you have to make sure that if people violate those pollution rules, there are penalties associated. For the most part, I will say that biggest players in these industries, whether it's auto industry or whether it's the power sector or whether it's oil and gas, the biggest players with the most exposure to stakeholders, to the investment community, to their employees, to the public, they generally comply with rules and regulations. I mean, they're not looking to land themselves in trouble, right? So sometimes big enforcement actions are necessary, and it's important to have robust enforcement capabilities. And generally, the government does a good job. But you're right that enforcement enthusiasm waxes and wanes in different administrations, and you tend to see in certain administrations a lot less money going into enforcement, fewer personnel, and more laxity. And so, yes, you have to have your eye on the ball of following through with enforcement after you issue these rules, and you want the regulated industry to comply for sure.
While much of the public's frustration with congressional inaction is directed at the federal legislative branch, it's easy to forget that regulation policy can still happen at the municipal and state level, which has far-reaching implications. So realistically, what role will or can local government, maybe we could say state government as well, play in accelerating the adoption of sustainable technology?
Yeah, I mean, certain leading states have been very important to climate and clean energy policy going back again to the early 2000s. They tend to be states like California, New York, Washington State, and there are others. There's a sort of subset of states that are quite forward-leaning, and indeed some states that are identified as, red or purple states that have embraced, say, wind power or solar power, not at least on the surface because of climate change concerns, but because it's good for their economies. So there are a variety of states that have adopted what are called, I think it's over half of U.S. states at this point have adopted renewable portfolio standards, which is just a reference for a policy that says the state's electricity needs to be produced by a certain share of renewable or non-fossil fuel sources over time. So you can set a target for 30% renewable portfolio standard by a certain date, or you can be slightly less ambitious, 10 or 15%. There's a variety of these standards across the country, but what they amount to is state policy to clean up their electricity sector. And they can do that without the federal government being involved at all. And that has been happening now, like I say, since the early 2000s. And it's been a very important movement to sort of pushing the federal level forward, setting federal standards. So the states have adopted a variety of the clean energy policies. They end up promoting clean technology because if you're going to set a target of having 30% of your electricity be so-called clean, that's going to spur technology deployment in your state, and that's going to create a new industry in clean tech. So there's a lot of that kind of thing that states can do. California is perhaps the biggest, most ambitious. California and New York are the most ambitious states setting these kinds of standards. They can set new building codes where new construction has to comply with certain efficiency standards. For heat and air conditioning and windows and doors. They can create standards for new construction. They can create standards to retrofit old buildings. There are all kinds of policies that the states can adopt to spur clean energy adoption without waiting for the federal government. And part of the challenge and what I'm really interested in is creating a menu of things and generating interest in policies that can be adopted by states, whatever their political valence. In other words, you don't have to sell all these policies as climate. For states where that's not politically as viable, you have to address why these policies are good for the economy, why they're good for jobs, why they're good for competition. And that's the framework in which you can push policies like this.
It's very helpful. So let's think then, we talked a lot about the mechanisms by which the various stakeholders can try to influence action. Maybe we can think of which actions themselves, which work. So from your point of view, what is has both highest impact and the most feasibility in driving the transition to the net zero economy? Carbon pricing, required investment screens, required carbon accounting and adaptation plan, municipal levels. Like, what are the mechanisms that, regardless of how we get there, what are the things that people should be driving toward?
It's like asking someone which is their favorite child.
If you like all of them equally, it's fair to say.
Look, I've always said this. I'm not an economist, but I'm pretty confident that if you don't price the thing you're trying to reduce, it makes it harder to reduce. You want to make carbon costly. You want to put a price on carbon. It's not free to the society to pollute. It costs the society. So you have to put a price on the thing that is so costly for society. And so one way or another, people talk about a carbon tax. For a very long time, we've talked about carbon taxes. People talk about capping carbon nationally, a cap and trade system. We've had for years and years a very successful program for capping acid rain that's built into the Clean Air Act. It puts a cap, it reduced year on year, create tradable permits. There are these models of policy tools that have been very successful that we could apply to greenhouse gases. The problem is Congress won't price carbon one way or the other. They won't put in place a carbon tax. They don't seem to be interested in capping carbon at a certain level and giving people allowances that they can buy and sell. That was the approach the Obama administration tried to get the Congress to adopt. And that was when the Democrats controlled Congress, and it did not succeed. So we have trouble at the federal level putting a price on carbon. It's often framed as by opponents as an energy tax. People don't like to hear about new taxes. They don't like to pay new taxes for obvious reasons. They are really, we could use a gasoline tax in this country, but of course there's tremendous resistance to a gasoline tax. All of those ways of pricing carbon would be helpful to reducing emissions and to spurring new technologies to control these emissions in more efficient ways. But in addition, all these other policies to promote clean energy, I'm in favor of renewable portfolio standards, heating standards for buildings, and the rest of it. Efficiency standards for things like our refrigerators and our microwaves and our big TVs. I mean, all of these things that promote efficiency save electricity, which means you have to produce less of it, which means you produce less pollution and fewer greenhouse gas emissions. So I view all of these approaches to be beneficial. At some stage, the economists will say, you've got overlapping duplicative programs that are far too costly. We're nowhere near that stage. I'm prepared to have that debate when we get there. But right now, the more policies you can demonstrate that really reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also spur clean technology, I'm in favor of.
Well, then let's turn from there into focus on from law to lawyers. It's a nice question. How do climate conscious lawyers balance clients' demands with ethical climate concerns, particularly when working with big fossil and utility companies?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will say that there's a real role to play to have clients who are wrestling with the energy transition, who have to think about how they're going to convert their business models into a low carbon world, who are dealing with compliance questions. How do they comply with new regulations, new demands? I think there's a very positive role to play. Whether you want to do that kind of work will depend on your personality and whether you want to work with businesses and give them counsel and advice, or whether you think your talents could be used better elsewhere. But I think you can do a lot of good being a really good lawyer to help clients see alternative pathways and to bring to their attention risks that they face if they do route A versus route B. The role of a good lawyer is often to broaden the perspective and say, here's what going this way means, here's what going that way means, and here's a solution, I think, for us. I think there's a lot of demand for that in sectors where they are facing the need to change. And that's true across the board in virtually every sector at the moment. So I'm very positive on doing that kind of work. Not everybody wants to do it, and I completely understand that. Some folks really see themselves working at an environmental organization or in the government, for example, whether it's state, local, federal, and I applaud all of those avenues. But others want to be working with business, working in the mix. And I think you can square your ethics as long as you're a faithful lawyer of integrity. I think you just have to manage those relationships and manage those options that you're presenting to your client really well, and have integrity when you do it. And I teach my students that, I tell my students that there are lots of different careers to pursue, and there are lots of different roles to find yourself in, and the one you choose depends on your personality, your interests, and your appetite for certain kinds of risks. And I think that's a good thing, that there are lots of choices. There are a lot of places from which to do good on this issue. There are a lot of locations in which to do good from this on these issues, and that's been my message for a long time at Harvard Law School.
Well, you led us directly into the next question, which was how to do good. For example, if you're a former lawyer, you have legal expertise, you're in law, but in not directly environmental law for a particular firm, but you want to improve laws or regulations, you want to volunteer, you want to help with climate change. What would be a good place to start? Are there organizations, websites, projects you can recommend? If people want to help, how can they help?
Well, first of all, you can do things locally in your communities. A lot of people want to work locally and be connected, especially in COVID, want to get connected back into community. And there are a lot of things you can do to promote green power, to try to get your local utilities to offer green power options. You can organize locally to promote awareness about climate change, to create competitions among communities to reduce their consumption. It's funny, in some communities, knowing that your neighbor is consuming less heat and power spurs you to compete to be even more efficient than your neighbor. In other communities, that's not the right approach. You can model good behavior even. I mean, if you can afford an electric vehicle, take advantage of the increasing models of electric vehicles, they're dropping in price, battery prices coming down. You can model behavior by buying your first electric vehicle or hybrid electric vehicle. And there are lots of NGOs doing great work, right, from the big federal environmental organizations to local community organizations, where you can volunteer and you can do work at those environmental or climate or clean energy organizations. You can if you have money to invest, you can invest in clean tech. I mean, it all depends on your resources and where you want to focus, but there is no shortage, I think, of opportunities to get involved in the issue. You can write pieces for a local newspaper. You can call and lobby Congress or your local legislators, your local utilities, as I say. You can make your voices heard. You can petition. There are a lot that you can do. I mean, a lot of young activism, which was very important in the last election cycle, which raised climate change to the profile of climate change to be a top tier issue for the Democratic primary, for example, local activism. So I think there are lots of opportunities to get involved.
From your perspective and your view on the oil and gas industry, this move from fossil fuels towards clean energy and the timing of this, who's driving this bus? How much of this is recent administrations, Obama and Biden, sort of pushing something and the industry finally coming near it? Or is this something that was going to happen anyway, and this is an opportunity for a real collaboration the Biden administration has formed? Who's driving this bus?
That's a really hard question to answer, because there's a dynamic between government policy, private sector behavior and incentives, and public demand for change. And it's hard to say any one of those things changes independently. I think they work together. And what you see some dynamics in the private sector that would have happened anyway. I mean, the revolution in hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling for oil and gas, which a lot of people are opposed to fracking, I recognize, but just bear with me for the moment. The innovation, the technological innovation unleashed, made accessible huge, vast quantities of natural gas in hard rock in spaces where you couldn't access it before. What that means is the price of gas dropped so significantly that it starts to outcompete coal. Natural gas is only about half as GHG intensive as coal. So it's still a fossil fuel, but it's cleaner on balance by comparison. So I'm telling you this story because if natural gas becomes cheaper than coal, then more natural gas that gets deployed instead of coal. Likewise, solar costs come down. The costs of the components for solar power come down. Battery costs come down. So you can put batteries in automobiles and sell them where they're coming close to achieving parity with traditional internal combustion engines. All this technological change is helpful and might have happened to some extent anyway without government intervention, but not all of it. So the fact that solar power costs come down has a lot to do with creating subsidies for wind and solar power, which Congress has done and keeps renewing over time. In fact, solar production, increases when we see these subsidies in place and decreases when we don't. Battery costs, they come down because of technological change. But if we put some R&D money into batteries, government money into our money, public money, we see faster innovation. So partnership between federal policies, usually tax or budgetary policy, investment, R&D dollars, can help spur innovation in the private sector. In terms of the oil and gas industry and the auto industry and the electric power industry and who's leading they're definitely responding to pressure from governments, not just the US government, globally, in all the places where they operate around the world. There are new policies that force change. I think that's very important. I think industry is used to saying, tell us what the rules are and we will comply. And I think that's appropriate, and the government has to do its job. At the same time, I think there is a new reckoning with climate change. As I mentioned at the top, as you mentioned in the intro, I'm an independent director on the board of ConocoPhillips. From that perspective, I'm able to push from inside a boardroom. I'm able to advance some thinking, some ideas, some innovation that maybe it would have taken longer to get to. And it's clear to me that there's enormous pressure, not just from the government, from investors and stakeholders and employees on what's the vision for a transition strategy. And I think all of that is combining both external pressure, internal demand to accelerate change. I also would just say, who's driving it? We have to drive it too. Consumers, us. We have to drive it by electing people who will pursue policies we support, who will respond to climate change, and by making our voices heard when things aren't going fast enough. So, this problem is an all hands on deck problem. Climate change and the harms it causes and the risks it poses to society and the costs it creates. And we're already living with some of these impacts that are quite severe, and they're only going to get more severe if the scientists are correct, which I think they are. I have no reason to believe they're not. And the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report suggests that we are at greater risk than we thought of all of the kinds of effects you guys have been witnessing. Terrible wildfires, very inconsistent weather from extreme hot to extreme cold, deluge kind of storms, more intense hurricanes, and all the rest. And you know about all this now, and you've seen it and witnessed it on top of a global pandemic. So we have to be vigilant and active too. So when you say who's driving the bus, there's my theory of the case is that government needs to do its job. In my view, the United States Congress is not doing its job on this issue right now. Industry has to do its job. It has to respond to the challenge and come up with business models and transition planning to move toward a decarbonized world. And consumers have to do their job. And we have to be willing to change behavior and to behave responsibly as voters to demand the politicians who will adopt the policies we support.
Underlying something you're saying, I just want to push this a little further by asking you to test an oversimplification. Is carrot better than stick? Should we, whether as voters or as our elected officials, should we be pushing more incentives versus enforcement and constraint and rulemaking, or do these need to go hand in hand?
Again, I'm one of those inclusive people. I think that combinations of these things, incentives, binding standards that set a floor and encouragement to go above that floor, rewards for doing better. We have to put a suite of policy tools in place that also we have to be cognizant of what businesses are trying to achieve. I mean, we do consume this electricity and we do consume these products to fuel our lives. And we have to be prepared to change what we demand, that we're going to consume less of these products, that we're prepared to pay the price of the transition. And that could have some impact for us as a society. It will have some economic impact. So I think a combination of incentives and requirements and standards is unavoidable, is necessary. And I think being sensitive to the fact that you need a pathway for business to be able to produce the things that consumers want. We're still going to need to produce sufficient energy to fuel the society. How are we going to do that? How are we going to replace fossil energy with substitutes? This is hard, not easy. And so I think, a combination of incentives and subsidies, research and development and technology, government support for good behavior, for improvement, and a floor that cannot be, we can't drop below. I think those are crucial building blocks. And then incentives for exceeding them on top, I think, are very important. I don't think there's one silver bullet that solves the problem of climate change. You can't wait for the technology that claims to suck carbon dioxide out of the air, direct air capture, to succeed. We can't wait around for a silver bullet. We have to engage in the transition starting now and pushing forward. The question about carrots and sticks put me in mind of, there's another piece of this puzzle that we really need as a society to talk about. In fact, I'm doing a webinar with President Bacow and Ernie Moniz of MIT and some Harvard researchers like Dustin Tingley on the faculty and Steve Anso-Valera on the faculty, who have been working very hard on a project called the Roosevelt Project. We're doing that tomorrow morning, actually, to talk about research, multidisciplinary research into what it would take to move fossil fuel dependent communities through this transition. Very important question. Often it's called the just transition challenge, which is how do we support the movement of these communities into new jobs, new careers, new industry, new economic development. And that is a crucial part of the climate problem. You can't just declare that we're going to make a massive transition and abandon the communities that have grown so dependent on one form of energy. So I mentioned that because, first of all, Harvard's producing is a partner in this project. Ernie, when he started it in partnership with Harvard, President Bacow, I think, is very proud of it. That's why he's doing the webinar. And this is the kind of thing we need to be paying attention to, in addition to all the incentives we were talking about before and the rules and regulations we were talking about before.
Very good. Well, this actually leads us very nicely into my final question, which is, and because you talk about, as you say, your upcoming webinar with President Bacow, Deputy Provost Tingley, et cetera. What are the most important things that Harvard as a university can do to help combat the climate crisis?
Well, that's a very timely question because we just have a new vice provost for climate and sustainability. Jim Stock was just named. I think he has a very ambitious agenda to set out. I think that we can expect big things from the university going forward. We're already doing an enormous amount across the university in very different departments, from the sciences to the humanities, to the law school, to the Kennedy School, to the public health school. It's an amazing amount of productivity, scholarship, research, and concrete solutions being developed across Harvard University. I think what we need to do is build on that work and cross some bridges and pursue as much collaboration as we can, both across departments and schools, but also in partnership with with private sector partners and also places like MIT right down the road, where we can leverage the work that's already going on into even larger projects with greater impacts that can really make a difference. And President Bacow has made clear that he wants Harvard to have a greater impact in generating climate solutions. I think that focus is what you'll see at the university at a very high level in the next few years.
Fantastic. That's a good place to end. So thank you very much, Jody. And thanks to all of you who have joined us today. We hope you join us for more signature events soon. Information on upcoming events, as well as recordings of past ones, can be found at vpal.harvard.edu/vpal-events. So good night, everyone. Thank you for being part of the conversation. And thank you all for helping to make a difference.